This is the Africa Sphere Podcast.
Welcome to Africa Sphere News Podcast, your source for the latest news across the continent. We've got a great show lined up, so stay tuned.
Hello to all our Africa Sphere Podcast followers. Today we have a very special guest, a seasoned diplomat. Ambassador, welcome to the Africa Sphere Podcast. How do you interpret President Trump's recent comments on Ethiopia and the Renaissance Dam?
And do they signal a major shift in U.S. policy on Nile water disputes?
Not really. This has been an administration by administration approach. If you remember, during Trump's first administration, when I was Assistant Secretary for Africa, the president also got the U.S. involved in trying to come up with some kind of a agreement between Egypt and Ethiopia. Unfortunately, at the time, it was similar as now, because when the United States was involved, it was not what I would call an honest broker. As we would say in American English, he put the thumb on the scale in favor of Egypt. And that's one of the truths that you cannot deny, because it's a geopolitical factor that if somebody asked the United States to choose between Egypt and Ethiopia, it would be Egypt, given the scope of interest that the United States has with Egypt, as opposed to Ethiopia. Now, will that always be so? I don't think so, because in the future, Ethiopia might become a more important partner. But for now, it's that way. So if the United States gets involved again, and if the two parties agree, then I just really, really hope that this time the United States is a little more neutral than it was the first time.
Let's address the elephant in the room. President Trump claims the U.S. sites the Renaissance Dam, but the fact is Ethiopia funded it independently, correct? What's your conclusion?
It cannot be substantiated under any circumstances. What I think is that since the United States has paid for so many different projects around the world, I think it's something that the president just assumed, because I doubt if he was fully briefed on this ahead of time. So bottom line, of course, it's not true.
Based on your diplomatic experience, what's preventing Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan from reaching a binding agreement on the dam and why?
And why are other riparian countries excluded from these talks?
Well, I think basically the second part of your question first, as you know better than anybody, there are two Niles. And the part of the Nile we're talking about basically involves the three countries. The source is Ethiopia, for what is I think it's around 80% of the Nile waters. It flows through Sudan, then it goes into Egypt, and then you have the situation, the real situation, that even though Egypt does not put one drop of water into the Nile, it depends on its existence largely on the Nile going through Egypt unimpeded. So to answer the first part of the question, there's been a historical difficulty, because when the Nile treaties were first established, Egypt was all powerful and Ethiopia was very weak geopolitically. Year by year, the power equation has shifted. The one thing that does not change is Sudan is caught in the middle. So they have to, I think, find ways to accommodate both their very powerful northern neighbor and then Ethiopia as well. So you've had Egypt historically coming at this as being the strong partner, and now all of a sudden Ethiopia is no longer a weak partner, and the two sides have approached the negotiations differently. Egypt has been looking at it from a political point of view, whereas Ethiopia, as we all know, tends to be very technically oriented. And there's also been a lack of mutual respect. So until those conditions are qualified, I think it's going to be very difficult to come up with an agreement.
How do you balance Egypt's water security concerns against Ethiopia's development rights? And what about critics highlighting Egypt's wasteful water management?
And that's true. We know how, the methods that Egypt uses, and some of the irrigation systems are outdated. There's considerable water wastage. If you look at the two countries, though, everybody has to admit that the Nile is much more important to Egypt than it is to Ethiopia. For Ethiopia, as you pointed out, it's a source of incredible development, then probably revenue. Also, we have to say national pride, because it's one aspect of Ethiopia that I think every Ethiopian agrees on. Whereas for Egypt, it really is a matter of survival. So so for the Egyptians to come to a deal, it's much more important than for Ethiopia to come to a deal.
Most Nile Basin countries signed the CFA, the Cooperative Framework Agreement, in 2010. So why hasn't it been effectively implemented?
Well, but because of the one of the most important countries that is involved, Egypt has not signed on to it, as far as I know. So at the end of the day, all of these things aside, the fundamental is that Egypt and Ethiopia have to come to some kind of an agreement. And that will take, when they do come to agreement, and I'm saying when, not if, that will take a major source of instability for the entire Horn of Africa region off the table.
If U.S. mediation is needed, what role should it play given the failed 2020 Trump-era negotiations and today's geopolitical landscape?
If I was advising the president, my advice would be for the U.S. not to play any role in those negotiations, to leave the mechanisms in place which are already in place instead of getting involved, because unfortunately the U.S. will not be seen as a neutral party.
What lessons from your tenure should inform current policymakers about Ethiopia's negotiating positions and red lines on the Great Renaissance Dam?
Well, as I said, for Ethiopia, it's very important, not as important as it is for Egypt, but very important. And Ethiopians paid for the dam. It represents a tremendous step forward in development, and Ethiopians are, as far as I can tell, as united on the dam as they are any other issue. So from that perspective, I think the Ethiopian government has a fairly strong hand to play as having, strong popular support for its position.
What are the strategic implications for U.S. interests in the region if tensions between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan escalate over the Great Renaissance Dam?
Unfortunately, there are so many points of tension right now in the Horn of Africa that would be just one more. It's already ongoing. So that's why I said that it would be very important to take that point of tension off the table so they can focus on the other points of tension.
How might competing international interests, including China's infrastructure investments in Ethiopia
and traditional U.S.-Egypt military ties, complicate American diplomatic efforts?
China is a factor in just about everything that the United States has going on now, not just in the Horn, the rest of Africa, Latin America, as we have seen in East Asia. So, but in the GERD, it's really not a factor. There are enough factors already. It's not a factor. I mean, the bottom line is Egypt and Ethiopia have to agree. They have to be the ones that conduct the negotiations. And at the end of the day, there has to be a resolution.
The Nile's future flows with its youth. How can we ensure their energy and intellect lead the conversation,
especially when they are often left out of economic and political discourse?
Well, what the people on the ground can always do is try to influence the positions their governments take. In democratic societies, it's a little more easy to do that than in autocratic societies. If anyone thinks that Papa Museveni is going to listen to what the young people who who live along on the ground have to say, then I think that is false. But my message is, I have lost all faith in the old men of Africa. Old men, not women, but the old men. The one promise Africa has is in the youth. So the youth flexing their political muscle, I have been so admiring of that. I know that the youth of Africa want the exact same thing that the youth in Europe and Latin America and Asia want. They want good job opportunities and a government that actually meets their needs and provides services. And they have to keep pressing for that. It's not going to be easy. But in the end of the days, the youth are going to win because they're the youth and the rest of us are going to be dead.
That's all for today's episode. Ambassador Tibor, thank you for this enlightening conversation.
To our audience, thank you for listening. Stay curious, stay hopeful, and we'll see you next time.
This is the Africa Sphere Podcast.